Today's World Insight with Tian Wei. China and the U.S. still locked in talks over trade. What's next? And the transatlantic NATO alliance turns 70. NATO's Deputy Secretary General talks about the viability of the alliance amid differences with the U.S.
President Bush, President Clinton, Obama, President Bush II, they all talk about more burden sharing in NATO.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Monday to Friday on CGTN. Washington hosted the 9th round of China-U.S. trade talks this week, aimed at sorting out sticking points in trade relations. Just one day before the negotiation on Tuesday, the World Trade Organization cut its forecast for trade growth in 2019. WTO cited the rising trade tensions and economic uncertainty. Despite uncertainties, China stands its ground with opening up and higher quality development. Take a look at this.
Tariff tensions will hammer global trade this year.
To the extent that we see global economic growth slowing down, everybody loses.
The WTO slashed its growth projection for 2019 to the lowest level in 3 years, down to just 2.6% from its earlier estimates of 3.7%.
Over the last year, we have seen a range of new tariffs put in place, affecting widely traded goods. Trade simply cannot play its full role in driving GDP growth when levels of uncertainty are so high. Greater uncertainty means definitely lower investment and consumption.
It has been almost 10 months since the U.S. and China slapped tariffs on each other, which has caused mayhem not only in the two countries, but also throughout the world. The downscaled forecast from the WTO reflects similar numbers from the International Monetary Fund. IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde called the global economy unsettled. But the WTO report also said strong import growth in Asia contributed to an increase in the commercial services trade sector, and goods trade volumes are expected to grow stronger in developing economies in 2019. As a rising economy amid challenging times, China remains focused on opening up. At the annual political season in March, China's foreign investment law was passed, which intends to give foreign businesses broader market access, protect their intellectual property, prohibit forced technology transfer, and guarantee a level playing field for both foreign and domestic companies. China is keen on pursuing higher quality development and improving innovation capability, rather than breakneck quantitative growth.
For more on China-U.S. trade ties, we are joined in New York by Max Wolf, professor at the New School University. In Hong Kong, we invited Hong Hao, managing director and head of research at Bocom International. In Beijing studio, Professor Liu Baocheng, dean from the Center for International Business Ethics from University of International Business and Economics. Gentlemen, welcome to the three of you. This is another big day for U.S.-China trade negotiations. A lot of things taking place in the White House when the Vice Premier Liu He visiting there and talked to the President of the United States. Now, Professor Wolf, given the fact that the text of the negotiations are reaching some promising stage according to the negotiators, what can we expect?
Yeah, so it looks like there has been some real progress, and that's certainly good news. We have seen this story about 10 times, as you pointed out earlier in the segment, though, so it is hard to know exactly where we end up. It does look like we'll at least continue talking, and it looks like we're going to get an announcement about the progress we've made and maybe a bit of a roadmap for the progress ahead when the two top leaders meet probably in a month or two, so that's definitely good. I think we've also reached the point where, for the Trump administration at least, and possibly more broadly, they do want to signal and be able to take home something. So while there are still some very large disagreements, both sides, I think, want to be able to take home some progress and some milestone of success.
several things, Mr. Hong, according to President Trump, that there is quite a good development, and he said if there is a deal, there is a summit. If there's no deal, there's no summit. Meanwhile, according to President Trump, so-called the granddaddy, I don't know what it means, but granddaddy of the agreement, something like that, is in the making. What is your understanding of all of these wording?
Yeah, I think definitely we're making some progress. The conclusion of the talks, the deadline has been pushing back a couple of times now, and I think everybody is sort of holding his or her breath, for some satisfactory outcomes. So I would say that there's some key longer-term structural details that needs to be ironed out. But once we get those things out of the way, then we should expect a satisfactory conclusion of the talks.
But timing is also important, Professor Liu. According to what President Trump from the U.S. side said, it might take weeks and probably longer, as long as it takes. Well, this has been the tone from the White House for long, since the earlier rounds of the negotiations, where there were very much speculations from different parts of the world about the result of it. Professor Liu, how do you see the timing and the possible content in the deal, if there is any?
Well, timing one is that the different power plays are still at work to push on either side of the negotiation table, and there are different expectations. So some would say, okay, we need some early harvest by having a chance to declare initial triumph. The other would, okay, we would push for institutional alignment. So, but for Trump, something that he can declare early triumph, that's very important. But for China, I think time is really in favor for China, because China is moving ahead with its own roadmap where the U.S. is not really prepared. So,
what do you mean by roadmap?
I mean, for Chinese domestic reform, and for Chinese the high-end investment law, high-end manufacturing, etc. So China is moving quite ahead, particularly after the 19th Party Congress. So whereas the U.S. is now experiencing, for example, the a dramatic fluctuation of the stock exchange, and the growth rate is not as optimistic as Trump has really boasted. So, he is really facing the increasing pressure, both politically and economically. So therefore, he is now in a rush to get something in hand.
On the other hand, Professor Wolf, the Chinese President Xi Jinping sent President Trump a letter. That letter, of course, is being presented by the Vice Premier Liu He this time, and the Trump administration calls it a beautiful letter. In the letter, as some reports in the media revealed, that there's calling for rapid conclusion of the negotiations, and also calling for strategic leadership of the relations in order to keep it stable and healthy. Well, some of those words might be abstract, and yet at this critical moment, they do not sound abstract at all, Professor Wolf.
No, it sounds very creative and positive and constructive. I think one thing we know is that President Trump is an enormous fan of being praised by himself and others. And if you give him an occasion to be praised or to praise himself, your ability to negotiate successfully with him is very good. We've seen probably no one do better with that than North Korea, but I think that the Premier and the President have had a pretty good personal relationship in the past, and it is important for them to at least reach a stability point. I don't think that we're actually about to see massive transformative breakthroughs. I think we're going to have a good enough deal, and what's going to be the top priority for the Trump administration is to sell it as a tremendous deal. That's why I think it's positive that Trump has been saying how close they are, and that President Trump is committed to celebrating his great success here. So it just has to be good enough to allow him to do that, and it will meet his core objectives for the 2020 election cycle.
Well, of course, the goalposts are so-called good enough for Trump politically has been moving from time to time, given the different circumstances. So how predictable, shall I put that adjective there, Mr. Hong, about the potential of reaching a deal and sticking to the deal by two sides while moving along with the rest of the relationship?
Yeah, well, from what I read in the press, really is that the USI is looking for some implementation details. You know, for example, how to ensure some of the agreement being executed in the longer term, and also, you know, how to ensure, you know, what we agree today is going to be carried forward exactly as it is, probably, you know, with some progress going forward. So I think those are the things that, you know, is sort of trying to people are trying to iron out in this negotiation. I think, you know, myself included, the entire market is really looking forward to the conclusion of these talks, and it seems that we're getting closer. You know, now that we have details, some details of the talk, and also some discussion about a possible summit. So those are good signs that the talks are really progressing ahead.
We want to put the China-U.S. trade negotiations not just as a bilateral trade negotiations, but rather looking at it through a bigger backdrop as we speak. Now, Professor Wolf, we see U.S. trying to push USMCA, and Trump in his latest tweet even mentioned that, together with the trade deal with China, saying they are both moving along nicely. We do not know what's his interpretation of nicely and why these two are closely linked together. Meanwhile, we also see the U.S. having a problem with its European counterparts regarding, for example, the car parts. That's a big issue between the United States and the EU. And at the same time, WTO negotiations going on for the rest of the year, and the U.S. also need to streamline its relationship with some of its other trade partners. So, Professor Wolf, how do you look at the China-U.S. trade negotiations and a possible deal in a larger context, as I just mentioned, and beyond?
So it's a great question. I think part of what President Trump has been doing is trying to refocus the anti-trade and anti-foreign sentiment of the United States toward Europe and Mexico and South America. And to the extent that he's able to do that, he'll still give them their conflict that they seem to like him having, and elected him to have very sort of nationalist conflicts with all kinds of people. So they'll still have their conflict, and then he can go ahead and take care of the very important business of signing the trade deal with China. I think there might have also been a sense among some parties in the West that the relatively good process of cutting a deal between Italy and China raised the prospect that if various groups don't come to a reasonable agreement pattern with China, that they'll be passed by other groups on a number of levels who are able to reach those agreements. So one of the things I think we've seen is, despite the occasional weak patch in the economy, the Chinese economy and the desirability of business transactions with China has been quite resilient. And so I think part of the strategy that the U.S. had been pursuing, particularly Trump had liked, was this notion that the U.S. has enormous leverage because the U.S. economy is uncommonly strong right now on an international basis, and the Chinese economy might be weaker. And that doesn't really look like it's true, and it looks like the U.S. is weakening, and China has found the bottom and is coming off of it. So there may also be the notion that the strategy assumptions about the relative position of the economies are starting to look quite dramatically incorrect.
Professor Liu, though China's growth rate is 6.0 to 6.5, that's according to the latest two sessions government work report. Meanwhile, China is actively pursuing possible interactions with different trading partners around the world. But how does China look at what is going on, the U.S. role now, both with China and the other parts of its trade relationships vis-a-vis the international trade negotiations, including that going on with the WTO?
I think the first priority China really considers is the world economic order represented by multilateralism, implemented primarily by WTO. So China is there to support and defend this platform. And China is also going to make a lot of efforts to rally support from many other trading partners, particularly from Europe. So on the second tier, China attaches still very strong emphasis on China-U.S. trade. After all, they are the two biggest economies.
Right.
And also there are also the other dimensions between China and the United States in terms of military, in terms of the diplomacy, education, etc. So, but in the meantime, I think the trade war launched by the United States is quite much a wake-up call to China that okay, China is not really, is not really preoccupied with the sort of romance across the Pacific. So China has to seek diversification and look for other partners, particularly to push forward the Belt and Road program.
Now, Professor Hong, Mr. Hong, though, several latest developments, the world taking note of China's trade relationship. Chinese President Xi Jinping's visit to Italy, having the memorandum signed, including with one of the G7 economies, that is Italy, and also latest trip to France, signing documents and trade deals such as Airbus. Meanwhile, New Zealand Prime Minister's visit to China, both sides vow to safeguard the multilateral trade system in the world, and China's interactions along the Belt and Road later in May, rather in April, this summit involving some of those economies, leadership coming to China and have this meeting. So one after another layer of China's also active role regarding trade. So how shall we look at the U.S.-China trade deal with these different backdrops as a bigger environment?
Yeah, well, I think China is really trying to promote multilateralism and also trying to re-engineer the system to be, away from the historically U.S.-centric sort of base international system. I think it takes a long time, but with the sort of a rise of China, and now that the Chinese GDP is more than 2/3 of the U.S. GDP, and if you calculate on a PPP terms, I would say Chinese economy is probably just as large as the U.S. So I think things are happening. I think the recent developments showing that not just the emerging market but also the developed world is trying to acknowledge the rise of China, especially in the international system. I think we're more likely than not going to see more progress from here.
However, on the other hand, Professor Liu, there are different opinions in the world. It's just a matter of fact about how they perceive China's rise and what it might mean to them in their eyes. In Europe, for example, there are different voices as well.
Yeah, even at home.
Even at home, of course. So the question really is, in factual terms, how will China contribute to the multilateral trade system and contribute to the spirit of multilateralism to begin with? Because after all, facts speak louder than words. So in the mid and the long term, that part of China will be very much testified or tested at the same time in front of the world.
Well, globalization is really the fact of the day. You can deny, but you got to react to it. So, but China reacts very positively because China has been engaged in a very deep learning process, and also over the past 4 decades, and particularly after China joined WTO, we see, in fact, as you say, China has really changed a lot. Our life, our living standard has changed. So China is there to defend, and there is no reason really for the world to to push back this sort of system into a jungle law. So this is really something very realistic approach, and people with ration, with responsibility, will have to go onto it.
Professor Wolf, China, as it says, if been making progress for the near future, including with the foreign investment law, the world is going to see a very rare example of a country of quite a different system continue to open up to the rest of the world and try to reform itself while at the same time keep it's a regional system. So that's quite a combination. Will the world be able to witness that and also contribute to the positive development as they happen? That's an interesting question for the rest of the world too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the world needs to adjust, and it'll be at different speeds and with different sort of particulars in some countries or regions versus others, but we're going to get a global multilateral order with Chinese characteristics. And much as the world has sort of adjusted to the market and industrial power of a central global economy with Chinese characteristics, being China, I think the global order will make that adjustment. My guess is that the more disruptive feature to the global adjustment really has been the sort of sudden, dramatic, hostile turn toward multilateralism in the U.S. and the prolonged and somewhat profound difficulties in some of the European countries, which have also led to what were historically sort of marginal voices politically coming to the fore. So I think when you look at the Trump years, when you look at the issues around Brexit, when you look at some of the more extreme voices in Eastern Europe, the changing of the world order away from a sort of Anglo-American sort of centric model has seemed to be the hardest for American and British voters and some in Europe. But I think the trend of history, the tilt to this is pretty much there. So it's a question of how you deal with and how you integrate and how you smooth a future world order with substantial Chinese characteristics, as well as China adjusting. But China's done more of the adjusting, I think, in the past, and the rest of the world will have to do a bit more than they have in the future.
Well, talking about the rest of the world, Christine Lagarde, the IMF Managing Director, Mr. Hong, talking about both the U.S. and China should not let this negotiation go on and on without seeing its end, because a self-inflicted, protracted trade war is going to hurt both sides and also everybody else in the world. But is that urgency going to be read carefully by leadership from both sides and negotiation teams from both sides? Once again, about time, it is very important.
Yeah, I think, let's hope that it's going to be interpreted in a positive way. And also, I think the Chinese negotiators are showing great initiative, and actually they are visiting the U.S., with very good intention, and also probably making good compromise as well. I think, going forward, we've seen how a dragged-out negotiation process, such as the Brexit process, is hurting the UK economy. I think, for the global economy's sake, let's hope that, the negotiation will progress fast, smoothly, and, yield satisfactory results.
Professor Liu, what about that thought? Particularly now, it is not just the trade negotiations. The U.S. President even raised during his talks with Vice Premier Liu He, who is not necessarily in charge of military. He asked both China, Russia, and the U.S. to cut this military spending. So it seems like there has been some kinds of different thoughts going on in his mind, at least when he was talking to Mr. Liu He. How is China reading these mixed signals?
Well, it seems that it is really also a learning process from the U.S. side, what is really going on in China, because many multivariables really get intertwined to form such sort of economic structure. Now, so China read the signal as really something, okay, where is the focus? China can really have build a priority list. So now the economic situation is the most important, while the bottom line, for example, Chinese sovereignty and Chinese unification and Chinese the autonomy in making their own decision will be the bottom line that China will not really make any compromise for.
Meanwhile, Professor Wolf, how important it is that the negotiators are focusing on the trade and economic issues, and those issues mainly, so that there will be a deal in the predictable future, so that we will not protract it and distract it to other fronts.
Yes, so it's hugely essential. I think the most encouraging actual fact, as opposed to mood situation on the ground, is we've seen, at least lately, a reduction in the threats of an escalation. So that's obviously important. Things are not looking like they're going to get worse quickly. That's important. But obviously, the deal is important. And although it's a bit of a fool's errand, I think the forecast is that the world has to understand exactly how profound this moment is. If it turns out that in this moment, China is the larger, basically compromising agent to maintain the global order, in essence, that is what defines global leadership, being the person who guarantees the global order, sometimes at greater sacrifice. If that's the case, then we might be missing the forest for the trees here, and we might be seeing, amidst all this anger and accusation, a passing of the torch of a somewhat epic variety going on right under our noses with scant mention and limited attention.
I see. But at the same time, China still believes itself as one of the largest developing economies. So a lot of issues for discussion for the rest of the world, and certainly between China and the United States as well for now. Thank you for tackling all these issues in front of the camera. For the three of you, Max Wolf, Hong Hao, Liu Baocheng, really appreciate it. Have a great weekend. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The Transatlantic NATO Alliance turns 70. NATO's Deputy Secretary General talks about the viability of the alliance amid the differences with the U.S. right after this break.
President Trump has really driven.
Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is marking its 70th anniversary. The alliance got its start during the Cold War 70 years ago. Western nations founded it to balance the military power of the Soviet Union. With the collapse of the USSR and the end of the Cold War, the world's biggest military alliance is playing down its anniversary celebration, as well as the many disputes among its allies, especially those between U.S. President Donald Trump and the rest. So how would these agreements within the alliance likely pan out? Is NATO's core mandate of collective defense still viable today? Earlier, I talked to a former U.S. diplomat who is now currently serving as NATO's Deputy Secretary General. She provides some positive answers on those questions. Take a look. Madam Deputy Secretary General, great to see female leaders in the field of security.
Thank you.
It is no secret that within NATO there has been a big debate over the past few years about what will be the role of the U.S., how much will the U.S. contribute, and how much will the other countries contribute to the overall budget and to the overall capabilities. Where is it going, your judgment of the direction?
We do have a debate in NATO going on now about burden sharing, about defense budgets, but I think about NATO as one big family, and any big family has disputes and disagreements from time to time. I'm sure here in China it's the same. Sometimes there are family disputes, and you work to resolve them, and you come back together again. It's been the same at NATO over time. We've had disputes from time to time. The 2003 war in Iraq is a very good example of that. But we've been able to resolve the differences and come back together. Actually, we really think that President Trump has played a good role because he has forced the NATO allies to really sit up and take notice of the commitments that they made in our so-called defense investment pledge to spend 2% of gross domestic product on defense. And so we really are quite positive about the role President Trump's been playing. I have to tell you, though, that every president, I remember President Bush, first President Bush, President Clinton, Obama, President Bush II, they all talk about more burden sharing in NATO. So it's been a consistent message, but President Trump has really driven it home.
Certainly he has his very different style, to say the least.
Indeed.
So now we're probably in a dramatic changing period of time that everybody is rethinking which group to join, which group to keep, where is the partnership, and what's the nature of the partnership. Therefore, I wonder about NATO as well, such a comprehensive, huge body. What is your thought and your colleagues' thoughts about this?
First of all, our work is really focused on the transatlantic space. as I mentioned before, we are the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so we have a traditional geographic sphere where we work. Now clearly then I get asked, well, how come you're in Afghanistan? Well, we have other, in addition to collective defense in the North Atlantic space, in the Euro-Atlantic space, we have a responsibility to fight terrorism. It's also one of the core tasks of NATO. And indeed, after the 9/11 attack on the United States, that is the only time that the Article 5 commitment was called forth by unanimous consent in NATO, that everyone said we need to stand up with the United States to fight this terrorist threat. It's why we are in Afghanistan today. And so, of course, we really work hard to continue to focus where we need to focus on our own defense and security, but we think because there are mutual concerns around the world, terrorism is a great example of that, that we need to also join with other countries in thinking about ways to fight these challenges together.
If you see the cooperation between the United States and NATO, or NATO as a whole, with the U.S. as an important player of it, for example, the war in Iraq, has not necessarily been a success. And NATO as an organization has your own identity rather than all the same on the list with the United States. So how is the NATO identifying your core values, particularly regarding a changing U.S.?
Well, I have to a little bit take
Go ahead,
exception with your hypothesis, and that is that somehow the United States and NATO are diverging in terms of values. We share the same values. We are a defensive alliance. We are based on the rule of law. We really focus on, if we need to take action, that it should be limited, defensive, and in line with our international law obligations. So we are always thinking in that way, and every member of NATO thinks in that way. Otherwise, we would not be the NATO alliance. It's basic to our DNA, so to say. But the other important thing I wanted to say is that we are 29 members, all of whom have an equal vote at the table. Any big decision that is made at NATO has to be made by consensus. Sometimes people say, oh, the United States, you know, they dominate the decisions. Well, in fact, every decision has to be made by consensus. And I think the Iraq War of 2003 is an example of where NATO did not reach consensus. And so therefore, it was a case where the United States and NATO were not exactly on the same page.
Madam Deputy Secretary General, you used to work for Washington, and certainly you made that switch beautifully. Now for NATO, how do you see this transition? One is working for a national interest, the other is working for a very much a group consensus, particularly at the moment when reaching a group consensus is extremely difficult for many organizations.
Well, you know, my husband, who spent his whole life working in the realm of multilateral diplomacy, tells me I'm very lucky that most of my career has been spent on working bilateral diplomacy with the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. So I have to say I feel the transition to NATO quite acutely, because now I am in a multilateral organization and I have to work those complexities every single day. But we are a great group, actually. It's like our headquarters at NATO. All the missions are there together. In some ways, it's like a big university campus. We are there working together every day, sometimes rubbing up against each other in the corridors, but always, in the end of the day, coming to agreement.
The world is changing fast, and it's not a cliche. We all notice that every day, almost, in the headline news. Therefore, what are the priorities? That seems to be a question everybody and every country, every organization is thinking.
We have our responsibilities for our collective defense. That is at the heart of our priorities. We also have responsibility for fighting terrorism. But I want to say further that we take very seriously the necessity to project stability, as we call it, to try to work with countries among our partners, for example, in the Mediterranean, in North Africa, in the Middle East, to try to build up state institutions, defense institutions, to try to build the notion of integrity in these countries in the fight against corruption.
Is there a potential China and NATO would work together on those fronts?
I think it will be very, very important to consider what must be the priorities in the work between NATO and China, and particularly because NATO and China are in very different geographic spaces,
Right.
and so we have very, very different points of view on a number of things and defensive requirements. But in the end of the day, I think we do have some mutual interests, and we need to explore those.
At the NATO Foreign Ministers meeting marking the alliance 70th anniversary, U.S. Secretary of State, however, Mike Pompeo urged allies to work together to confront emerging threats from Russia and China. Where does this leave China and NATO? The Alliance Deputy Secretary General, in an earlier interview, told me that there is no confrontation. The two sides need to fix a trust deficit, and there are many areas they can work on together. China and NATO, some say, have been inching together, moving gradually toward one another. Do you agree with that interpretation? What could be the fields that the two can really work on near future?
We have already seen some examples of NATO and China working well together. For example, during the height of the fight against piracy off the coast of Somalia, NATO and China were working in close proximity in the maritime sphere, and we had some very successful joint efforts in that context. So we already have some good experience to build on. I think the maritime sphere is an important one, but also we face so many common challenges, areas where we have to be thinking hard about the future and where we go from here on cooperation. Challenges such as the challenge of terrorism, for example, challenges related to new technology. They are both technologies that offer promise, but they offer complexity as well. And so the more that we are talking together, and I think that is the key, to have good lines of communication open and to be talking together, because China is really developing its global reach increasingly. NATO, of course, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so we have a Euro-Atlantic focus. But we are going to increasingly be operating in the same regions of the world, and so it's good we have lines of communication open. We need mutual predictability and good mutual understanding.
It is not easy for that handshake to take place. Many could remember the moment when China and the NATO be able to shook hands. What has managed to help the two sides to eventually walk and work together?
I think it is a very good military-to-military conversation so far. We already regularly have staff talks. Sometimes we are participating together in some courses, for example. So we already have good communications. We have experts who are increasingly getting to know each other. And when there is that good human contact, that's when I think cooperation starts to develop in some very mutually beneficial areas. But it's focused really on what is pragmatic, what works for NATO, what works for China.
But trust, not easy to build. It has to be done through a period of time. Having said that, though, the changes of the world, though, is demanding China and NATO to efficiently create trust and be able to do something as you just earlier described. How can we solve this dilemma in a way?
Well, any time there's a deficit of trust, it's because, I think, of two causes. Sometimes it's because events have gone in a certain direction and actions have been taken that create a deficit of trust. But other times it's just because there haven't been open channels of communication and there have been no opportunities to get to know each other. In some sense, that's a kind of simple way to build trust, to get to know each other.
3 decades ago, there was a bombing of the Chinese embassy. Chinese believe it was done by the NATO. That was the lowest point, almost, between the two sides for decades. But the two sides has managed to bring it back to a certain extent, as you have just explained earlier. Now, that kinds of quality and capability probably is even in more urgent need. What are those capabilities? What are those qualities? How can we cultivate them on a pragmatic basis?
Everyone is concerned about the fight against terrorism, the fight against violent extremism. And terrorists are taking some technologies off the shelf, like drone technologies, and they are employing them in operations. And so NATO, for example, is working on research projects to look for ways to counter such off-the-shelf technologies and look for ways to help in the fight against terrorism. I think we're all equally concerned in these areas, and so that's a fine example of ways in which I think we need to be communicating results and talking about how we need to apply some of these technologies for good reasons and not for bad reasons.
It is only with certain degree of trust that technologies can be shared and can be mutually applied and therefore to work together. It seems that we're always coming back to the trust issue.
That's why I always come back to the communication issue. We have to crawl before we can walk.
Yes.
And walk before we can run. Just like babies, going to children, going to grown-ups. And so I think that if we begin with small steps and particularly with dialogue and communication, we can begin to build that trust.
Some have been asking questions about China and NATO. What are they thinking if they are working together? Do they have a common direction that they have to tackle? Do they have a common challenge? Some say, what about what's going to be the role of the United States in this cooperation between China and NATO? And what will be the role of Russia?
Well, I think you pointed to common challenges, and that's the most important thing for us all to focus in on. And again, I revert to the example I raised of the threat of piracy off the coast of Somalia. There we had a very large international flotilla focused on providing security for commercial shipping and fighting the pirates. And there we had everybody involved. China was involved, India was involved, Russia was involved, the EU was leading the effort, and NATO was involved. But many of NATO's member countries, including the United States, were involved as well. So at times when we have common security challenges, we need to be thinking about ways where we can come together to work on solving those challenges.
Madam Deputy Secretary General, what a pleasure once again to be able to have you on our program and share with us your thoughts. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All the best.
Thank you. Deputy Secretary General of NATO. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night and have a great weekend.